Well, welcome to the SBE Podcast, the show where we here at SBE talk about important developments in, for example, business, science, society, and all the things that are related to that. My name is Marcel, and I'm a student here at SBE at the master's program myself, and I'm super happy to have the huge honor to welcome all the listeners and viewers here of the podcast as a new host for this show and to guide you through the upcoming episodes that we'll record here. But of course, I'm not alone. As it's typical for the SBE podcast, we have exciting guests here to discuss our topics with real experts in their respective areas. And that being said, today we have Dirk Brounen here, who joined Maastricht University, or rejoined Maastricht University. Why he rejoined, that we will discuss in some minutes, I guess. But he is now a professor here at the new chair of housing and household finance at the finance department of SBE, and has been previously teaching and researching at, for example, the University of Tilburg, the Rotterdam University, and also is the author of a book which is called, and sorry for my pronunciation, Nooit Meer Slapend Arm, which can act as a guidance within all the difficult decisions households can or have to make when it comes to their spendings and their financials. And this brings us to the topics that we will discuss today, because housing and household finance are big topics in general, and I think especially the students in this city know that housing and finding a place to stay can be a quite stressful process. And it's not easy to find a good place here in the city sometimes. And in addition to that, it's sometimes even harder to make smart and good decisions about the spending and how to organize your households and to try to make as smart decisions as possible. But thankfully, we have a guest and a professor here who is super experienced in this field, who is studying it for so long. Dirk, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for your invitation.
Maybe first of all, I mentioned some of your previous academic stations out of your more than 20 years of experience, but maybe you can take us a little bit through your professional career after finishing your own master's degree.
Yeah, so maybe starting with that then, because I did indeed graduate here in Maastricht 25 years and 6 months ago. not counting, but that's a fact. And I studied my last courses with Piet Eichels, who's still teaching here. And I found him really inspiring as a teacher. And after a while, he offered me a position as a PhD student, but then in Amsterdam, at the University of Amsterdam, where he also was part-time professor. And that's what I did. So I went to Amsterdam, and during the 4 years I was employed there as a PhD student, I also spent a semester at the University of Berkeley in the US. And I studied finance here, and then Piet Eichels is a specialist in real estate. So in America and in Berkeley, they combined the two, real estate and finance, quite advanced already. So I learned some lessons there, and then when I came back, I wrote my dissertation. After that, I got an offer in Rotterdam, indeed, like you mentioned. So I started my academic career after my PhD time there, and then also after, I think about 6 years, I became professor there in real estate finance. And 2 years later, I decided to switch again, because I do think it's always good to change environment every now and then. And that's more or less the reason why I left Rotterdam and also recently left Tilburg, because that's where I spent the last 14 years. And then returned back. And it was also a suggestion from Piet Eichels, so it's full circle. Mm-hmm. So the one who taught me at the beginning as a student and PhD is now also my colleague, which I very much enjoy. And also realize if I would do that maybe 10 years later, he would maybe have retired. Although I have some doubts about that now. I've been seeing him for the last 3-4 months. Pretty sure that this guy will never retire. Yeah.
How does it feel for you to be back in Maastricht after 20 and something years?
At 25, exact. Yeah. Actually, I also only realized it when I started in October, that it was 25 years, almost on the day. And it was very special because after 6 weeks, by coincidence, I gave a seminar already to my colleagues in the Department of Finance, because a seminar speaker fell ill and couldn't come. So I volunteered, and that was really nice because I realized at the beginning of that presentation that I was presenting my research agenda, that some of them have been my teachers, not just Piet Eichels, but also Stephanie Kleinmeier, for instance, and Dennis Bams, and these are now my colleagues. And also coming back to the building, I'm at the Tongerse Straat. It's almost identical as it was when I left 25 years ago. The Mensa has changed. Yeah, let's keep it at that. I have nothing bad to say about the Mensa. No, but the configuration is almost identical, which is really strange. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's very pleasant because I do like the atmosphere. It's very collegial. It's not because I'm in a podcast, but it's really true. In Tilburg, people are more focused on their own research agenda and more like solo artists. And here in Maastricht, there's a lot of collaboration. It's very natural. Plus, there's a lot of laughing around me, which I notice. So it looks like people take each other and themselves less serious, which I find very pleasant. Yeah,
absolutely. How do you witness the city just from living here and experiencing it 25 years later?
Yeah, also many cities where I've been in the past, when you return, it's not always improved, let's say, because cities tend to grow and have to grow, and not always in a elegant way. But I liked Maastricht, but Maastricht is also a very strange spot in the Netherlands because it's not really Dutch, and I enjoy that. I was born also in this region, so I know the culture very well. I don't speak the dialect, but I understand all versions of it, so people are warned now. But I like it. It really feels like coming home. And Maastricht in the last 25 years has changed, but for the better in many places. So there are a lot of areas that used to be quite rough or outdated that really have been refurbished, really nice. So I very much enjoyed it. I always came back to Maastricht every year a few times. I always enjoyed that, but it's a very foreign city in the Netherlands, which I think is good. Then the pace of life is a little bit slower and better. Yeah.
When we come back to maybe your career and all your experience that you made over the last 25 years, were there maybe some very special moments out of these remarkable accomplishments in general, but some maybe appointments or publishing a paper in a super highly profiled magazine where you always wanted to be at that point of time? I don't know. Were there these moments where you thought, wow, this is something super, super special right now?
Oh, that's a good question. And to be honest, I've never really been a guy with a plan. Mm-hmm. So when Piet Eichels offered me a PhD position, I had no clue what it meant. And he just told me, well, it's just like studying again. And then after you graduate again, you can do everything in life, which actually is completely not true. So if you do PhD research, you become a specialist in a very niche topic. And I'm not saying you can't do any jobs in practice or corporates, but it's less likely in my case. But it's fine, it worked out really well. So I just went with the flow in the first 5-10 years of my life. Also when I switched to Rotterdam, I had not a plan. But I do remember that one day I got promoted after being, let's say, publishing some papers, and that was never also in an intent. I didn't want to have promotion, but it happened because of the progress I made. And then in Rotterdam, you had to take a 4-day management skill course, and the last afternoon was called Making a Plan. And I'm a very structured person. That's also why I like household finance. I like to have an overview. But it's not that I would like to plan life in detail. I'm not saying that people shouldn't, but that's not how I went. But there they said, well, it's also important that you visualize what you would like to be as a professional in 5 or 10 years. And that was something I really didn't have. And that I started developing, and that also led to the fact that 1 or 2 years later, I became full professor already. So to be honest, if I didn't do that afternoon, I would just go with the flow. I'm not sure where that would have brought me, but I have been very lucky in life. So I never complain about anything that happened to me. I'm blessed in many respects. And I did write papers that I'm very proud of. So I did some research on auction sales of housing that have been distressed, foreclosures. And that's really because I think people can get hurt or, let's say, disadvantaged if they don't get a fair and full price. So some of those things, if I care about it, I do research. And in that example, I also found out that it helped change the law and was also discussed in Parliament. But also, to be honest, I didn't know that in advance. So I heard about the problem. I knew there was a data opportunity. I did research. I did make sure that my results would get in the media, and that also led to the fact that it had impact. So that is, I think, things I'm more proud of. Not maybe having a certain publication in a top journal, which is really cool, but I do enjoy a bit more that my research matters and sometimes can help improve or resolve a problem to some extent.
But that sounds great, because then I think we can jump into your research topics and discuss why they are so important. And again, especially I think for students in this city and all other cities as well, but especially here in Maastricht. Maybe first to get some clarifications. Your professor's chair is called Housing and Household Finance. Yeah. So maybe to split that up first. Housing. Of course, everyone knows this word and can relate to that, but from your perspective, what is housing from an academic perspective, and how do you broadly research within that field?
Yeah, so I've been a professor of real estate finance or real estate economics in Rotterdam and later in Tilburg. And real estate, of course, is a bit broader than just housing, but I always did a lot of my research specifically on housing. That also was data driven, because I have been using the Realtor Association database for the last 20 years, which is very unique, very micro. It was an opportunity, but also I think housing really hits home, literally, and it really affects people directly. And that alone already, I think is quite relevant for me. I mean, there's nothing wrong with investors in commercial real estate. I also like to do research on that if that's needed. But I like the fact that housing research really helps people in making better decisions, because buying a house or even renting a house will affect your financials deeply, right? And I will teach a course in a few weeks called Sustainable Real Estate Finance. To be honest, on the way over walking here, I still have to discuss this afternoon with my co-teacher. I decided I will switch a paper because I have a paper in the literature that really talks about young people, like students, maybe 5-10 years in their job, whether it's smart and prudent to buy or rent a house. Mm-hmm. And if you ask people, they have an inclination to say, I prefer buying. Mm-hmm. And there are very many reasons, but a lot of those reasons are not fully data-driven, not fact-checked. It's more like a blast from the past, and I'm not opposing that buying is not smart and prudent. But this is an academic paper that really delicately looks back in, is it really true that if you are buying, you are better off? And in which circumstances is that the case? But it also shows you the drawbacks. And that's more or less what I would like to do. So on housing, I really would like to give the objective view on the data, because we are moving into a future in which I'm not certain that housing is always preferable, also for young people, because of course you would like maybe to be flexible. So you have transaction costs that can be quite hefty in housing. But it also incurs a lot of, responsibilities. It locks you into a mortgage, and these kind of things is not for everyone. We have seen that in the credit crisis. So that's why housing, I think, is my favorite topic within real estate. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I definitely have some questions on that whole buying topic, because as you said, this is a relevant topic and question for a lot of young people who are also about to graduate and thinking prospectively. Mm-hmm. But maybe before that, you as a professor for housing, how do you view the current housing situation here in Maastricht?
Yeah, it's here in Maastricht, but it's even, I think, quite generic and dramatic in the Netherlands as a total. And so when I switched to Maastricht, I now call it myself, maybe I shouldn't mention it like that in the podcast, but I call it the Super PAC, because it's, I think, a cool name, and it relates to organizations that help a presidential candidate in the US. And it's doing something similar, because I've always been working for the last 20 years with corporations and organizations from practice. And I really like that as an academic. They don't determine my research agenda, but if I have something that is relevant, I can share it with them. And they can also make sure it will be used. And in this case, it will be the Ministry of Housing. I knew that from the beginning. And they have also committed to this chair for the next 6 years. And why I mention this now is that I think the situation of housing is quite worrying, and but also for the Ministry of Housing. So they are trying to come up with new policies and means to relax the housing market a bit, especially also for young people, because I think they suffer most and will also do in the upcoming years. But it's not a problem you can just discuss and mention every now and then. Fixing it is quite complicated. And in the Super PAC, I'm not sure whether I should refer to them as that, but in this ecosystem, this coalition, I will put them together in the room with people in the housing market that also have to construct houses or invest in houses, like pension funds. And I think the dialogue among them, and combined with the research that we can offer, can help to come up with better perspectives, because making smart, prudent policies is not a simple task. So also here in Maastricht, it's a demand-supply game, but changing supply is really difficult with housing. And also the supply that is in place, who are you catering to? So we have social housing in the Netherlands, which is quite large. Are the right people being serviced? So these kind of questions, I think, will need to be addressed when you want to relax the housing market. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Maybe if we also, because you touched it already, that whole topic of household finance, which I think then results out of the questions about housing in general.
Yeah.
Before getting into that, to me as a person who has never really been, also in an academic way, in touch with these topics,
Yeah.
I'm of course curious how or where does your motivation, if you know that, came from on focusing on a field like housing and household finance?
Yeah. So household finance has been in me from birth almost, and it sounds really scary, and I guess it also is, to be honest. So it has not really been coined household finance for a long period. I think it has only been around as a term for the last 15 to 20 years. But in the book I wrote, and just wrote that book because I felt the topic is important and I would like to have everyone think about it once a year. And this book is really written in a very simple way. So for everyone, you don't have to have a college degree to understand this book. And I wrote it in 2017. But in the book, I also have this anecdote. I can share it here. It's not a trauma anymore. But I think when I was 10 or so, I know the summer was coming and our wash dish broke down. Our washing machine broke down. And I remember that I walked with my dad to the shop and he told me, this is why we have reserves. Mm-hmm. So you have to save money for these kind of events. I thought, wow, good lesson. Thanks, Dad. Mm-hmm. So I didn't need to say that, but that's probably what I thought. But in the same summer, and it's also explained in the book, we went on a holiday to Austria with our car, and we went into a tunnel, upward sloping, and all of a sudden we slowed down, black smoke, and we hardly didn't make it through the end of the tunnel. It's almost symbolic, I guess. Mm. But that was not nice, and the car needed to be repaired. And I remember that I didn't eat for the whole holiday ice, because I thought, well, I think we're out of money now, because we just spent it on a washing machine. Mm. Our reserves are now exhausted. So, and actually that was not the case, but it always has made a great impression on me. I mean, I wasn't really born poor or so, but I was very aware. And this anecdote has a lot of lessons, at least later in life, that I think it's important that you talk with also your kids or your environment about money, because I misunderstood probably the situation. My response for not eating ice or skipping everything was a bit exaggerated. Maybe that says something about me as a child of 10. I also married a wife who is different in life, who made my relationship with money easier, let's say. So I'm cured thanks to her. But I do think it can go wrong in many ways. So you can be fixated on money because you want to be rich. And then you listen to podcasts on cryptocurrency and how to become a billionaire, which I think is pretty sad every now and then. But also you can be poor, or you think you might be poor. And there's very little in between. So household finance would be useful to get people in between, so that you have a very healthy relationship with money, not being obsessed with it, not being, let's say, traumatized by it, but also having the feeling that you do have the overview, so you know what can happen, and that's fine, because you are prepared. But that requires a lot. So that is why household finance. And to be honest, when I decided to leave Tilburg, I thought, let's come up with a new name for my new chair. So I just made up housing and household finance, and that might be one of my better ideas in life, to be honest. So I like it.
Yeah.
It's something you can just come up with yourself. And I really want to work for the next 5 to 10 years on household finance. And housing clearly is the biggest decision you will make in household finance in most cases. So that's why it's a very logical combination.
But then here again, to really understand what you are studying within that topic of household finance in detail, what is the focus of your studies there? What does it include, but what maybe does it also exclude when you study?
So household finance starts, I already did some research on very simple questions on what do typical people understand of finance. So we teach finance as a course, a mandatory course in college, but many people don't take university degrees. So many people never get a course of finance, which is fine. But very basic understanding about interest rates, savings and inflation, these kind of things have been already metriced as financial literacy. So we first assess what does a typical person understand? And if you don't understand it, it's very difficult to make good decisions. So we also think if people don't understand, what can we do to improve financial literacy and awareness? So household finance is about that as an ingredient, and then seeing and observing people over their life cycle, being young, getting a first job, maybe getting married and a child. You will have to adapt your household finance to that situation. And how do people do that? And to make it more complicated, society changes. So when I was programmed in the past by my parents, life was very safe. So people liked to have, I'm for instance a civil servant because I work at the university, so I am a member of ABP. And ABP determines my pension, which is fine because they typically do quite a good job.
ABP, by the way, is the
pension fund.
The pension fund
for all civil servants in the Netherlands. So if you become a civil servant, you have to become a member of them, which is fine. But it also means there is no dialogue. Also means I never had to think about my pension because they took care of it. Yeah. That will change in the future. So in the future, you can make choices. You can also maybe choose to build up your own pension. And more than 1 million households in the Netherlands already don't have a pension fund because they're an entrepreneur. And that wasn't there in the past. I also predict that, for instance, if you buy a house, you can take a mortgage, which is now typically 30 years. That might change. So it might become a mortgage of 40 years perhaps, or a mortgage in which you can amortize, repay, or sometimes may even take money out, I hope, in the future. So we face, I think, a future with a lot of more flexibility and also household decisions than in the past. And I worry about this because most people I talk to think not about these kind of things because they never had to. So it's not that these are dumb people, simply also well-educated people sometimes think very little about household finance because they assume everything is taken care of, which, to be honest, is not always the case. So I really think it's also a bit of a psychology aspect. How can we nudge people into becoming more aware about what they have and what they want? And how can we make sure those two can get together? And that's really what household finance is all about. It's about mortgages, pensions, maybe even insurances or inheritances, savings and investments. Maybe when you say it like that, doesn't sound very exciting, but the combination will always happen in your life. And it's better if you think about it, because if you don't, it will happen to you. And that's not the best.
Do you sometimes observe that, for example, as you said, that life situations change? For example, now you become parents or you get promoted to a new job or maybe lose your job or whatever. Like things that really can change also quite short term, that people underestimate in these situations the importance of that knowledge that you just talked about?
For sure, yeah. So I think there are two kinds of events or transitions, if you like. So there are things that actually happen quite slow. So my kids are now 19 and 20. So that happened over the last 90 to 20 years. Yeah. I've been there. I was witnessing that. But my daughter, for instance, is like many students now looking for an own address, a place to live. It could be an apartment, a studio, or something to share. And it's really complicated, very expensive. So I sympathize with that firsthand. but also can see what it brings around. So it can bring a lot of anxiousness and uncertainty. And we have thought about it in advance, so we have saved up money, so we are well positioned, but still we struggle. Nothing is actually solved, and we will move, my wife and I, in June. So I like that idea, but not the fact that we haven't found a new address for my daughter. Yeah. So you would like to prepare for those kind of life changes, because it wasn't a surprise 5 years ago that my daughter would be 19 today, right? But still, it doesn't mean you can fix everything, but you can get prepared. And then you have life events, like you mentioned, and so you can also lose a job or even get divorced, or somebody can pass away. I mean, that is always dramatic by all definitions. And having at least household finance a bit in control means you become a bit more flexible. So you can also respond better to that, because if such a life event would finish everything, that's quite dramatic in fact. So you never will enjoy these kind of life events that I mentioned now. But I mean, it's important because I also talk to friends who then don't have a pension fund because they're entrepreneurs, and a slow event like, for instance, retiring, I asked them, so how do you take care of that? They say, well, I bought a house, by then we will have amortized it, so that will be taken care of, which I don't think is a very smart answer, because you will still live in the house, you don't have to pay maybe rent or mortgage, but you don't know whether the value of the house will be sufficient for the needs you will have in the maybe next 20, 25 years. So when I ask that, people get annoyed, of course, when I ask then, but I would think it's better to make a calculus once a year to see what do I need for the next 5 years and why, and how can I make sure I'm prepared for that. Yeah.
What practical recommendations would you then give just to be prepared in case something happens? Is it more like your dad said back then, having some savings, or is it more being educated, mix of both, other components?
Yeah. So it's an off-print that we have here on the table, because I wrote the book as Budgeting Happiness. But that's also what is now on the cover. But it was published actually, like you said, Nooit Meer Slapend Arm, which means never poor overnight. And that is because the publisher liked that title better. That's how it is actually being sold. And the book is from 2017, so I'm not making an advertisement for it now, because I do think it needs to be updated. So I don't recommend to read and buy it now. I will provide a new version maybe next year for free, so that people can look forward to that. But in the book, I answer your question, because in the end, I say there are more like 5-6 major decisions. Once you calibrate those every year once, because if you buy a house, typically you live in it for 10-15 years, your mortgage will not be adjusted, but your life will change in 10-15 years. So if you think about, I always recommend between Christmas and Sylvester, because you're home anyways, you can think back of the year, but you can also do the admin a bit for half an hour, and then that's actually what we do at home. It's a bit strange, but I do talk with my wife and my kids about also our financial situation, because if I would let's say pass away suddenly, they also are aware of our situation, which I think is only smart. But it also is important, because it also shows, okay, is everything aligned with what we would like to achieve? So we're not talking about the details of our wealth, but really I also talk with them about holiday plans for the future. I think if you really think ahead a bit, and also look at the overview, and those 5-6 decisions are the chapters in the book, and it's a very simple exercise. And of course, if you're 20, you think, well, you just have to enjoy life, and that's fine. But as soon as you become, let's say, also professionally active, I think it's smart to do this, and it's a very mild exercise.
When you're touching on your book right now, for those who are watching this podcast on video, you brought a second book with you, which is called The 100-Year Life, written by 2 authors called Linda Gratton and Andrew Scott. Why have you bought that book as well today?
That book is much better than my book. That's one. Yeah, I read it also after I wrote my book, so it's not, let's say, the inspiration. I think The 100-Year Life is an excellent book to read for everyone, to be honest. So I read it, I'm not even sure when, maybe 6 years ago or so. And it really helps, at least I'm 48 now, people of my age and older to better understand young people, but it also can help young people to understand themselves. It's a very nice, kind book written by two people who explain that if you are born today, statistically you can reach the age of 100. But living a life that can span 100 years will be a different life than the life that I was brought up to. So I was brought up by parents who probably implicitly assumed people would die when they would be 70, because that's the age that their parents would reach. And society has also been organized in the 1950s in the Netherlands as if people would die when they would be 70, because that's when the pension system came into place, and it only had to pay people for 3-4 years. So it's easier, let's say, to pay pension for 3-4 years than when people get to 100, because then it becomes very expensive for society. And I like the book because it explains why young people have the inclination to use and share instead of own, for instance. And a lot of people of my age say, well, yeah, that's because they're young. But just wait until they're 25 and then they want to own a house and they will just be like you were when you were 25. And I really don't believe that's true. I really believe young people now are different than young people in the past. And I think it's a good thing. So I was pleasantly surprised by a lot what the book had to offer, and that made me understand my own children better, but also my students. Yeah.
What do you think that this different view by many young people on, as you said, sharing, maybe subscribing to some things, maybe in other areas of life, but if I think of myself and my friends and my surroundings, I think that new technological changes, for example, offered the opportunity to, for example, subscribe to music instead of buying it. Exactly. Or the same with movies or books or whatever. Do you think that there is also like a connection to household finance and spending in that regard? Also, yeah. So so I read the book after I wrote my own, but I do think you can link those two to each other. So the anecdote I have there is that when I was lecturing in Tilburg once, I was walking across two buildings on campus, and I always noticed a lot of blue front tires on bikes. So I asked my students before we started in a break, why do you guys have these blue tires? What is that? And they explained me the concept of swap bikes. So I explained them immediately that makes no sense, because I asked them, of course, how much do you pay every month, and then the almost the baby boomer in me, which I actually, to be clear, I'm not. So that doesn't make sense, because it's better to buy a second-hand bike for 4 years, do your own repairs. It's much cheaper, which probably is rationally true, but it probably says more about me, let's say, than the concept. And that's what this book is. So this book really nourishes transitions and makes people more willing to make transitions. People of my age and generation are not trained to make transitions. We were said, take this university degree, get a very good employer, and stick with that for 40 years. That's safe. Young people probably need to work maybe even 50 or 60 years, and then it becomes much more likely that you will go with what you learn here for 10, 20 years, but then will be inclined to learn something new and transition into a new professional. And I think with household finance, transitions, being, let's say, susceptible, willing, but also open to transitions is very important, because if you would do household finance like I did in the past with my 10-year-old anecdote, being afraid that things go wrong or change, that's a very unhealthy approach. You can't predict the future, so you should not be just focused on the risks. I think the book explains transitions are something very positive, but it also sometimes comes with a price tag. So taking an MBA maybe when you're 45, that also requires some spending of money or maybe time. But it's worthwhile, because that means you will have an updated version of yourself for the next 10 to 20 years. And I think that is promoted really by the book that inspired me. But also, again, let's focus on this from a student perspective, with all these different opportunities that you have on how to spend your money, on all different things in general. What are the main challenges from your perspective for students nowadays when it comes to the decision-making process in household finance?
Yeah, so I think the positive advice I can tell you as an old person is that I think it's also good to relax about transitions. So make sure you are open, let's say, to change, because I do think it's easier for younger people now than it was in the past. So household finance, and my advice would not be make sure you have this 5-year plan that I got when I was at Erasmus University, because you don't need it really when you're 20. I also saw the podcast of Piet Eichels years ago here, and I think he said something very similar. It's not that my personal opinion is that you should not just go and take the career with a famous logo and become an associate and work 80 hours and build a career. I mean, if people like that, it's fine, but that's not the only way to success. I think if you would be young, and it's what I also tell my kids, I think it's very important that you find something that you are really intrigued by. So we are living in the era of impact, at least I hope, and I hope also then positive impact, to be clear. So I think if I would start a career, I also would be much more looking for that. And having household finance means I do have this overview. Once or twice a year I sit down and see, what do I have, what do I need? Maybe starting with needs is better because it's healthier, because you will find out I don't really need that much. And then you don't have to oversave. So what the mistake I made in life is early on when I got kids, I thought, shit, I have a 30-year mortgage, I have 2 kids. So I started building and collecting buffers as if I was a squirrel and there was a winter coming, and there was never a winter. So I don't think that's healthy. That would be advice. So you can find balance. So you should think about the future. Don't try to predict and plan it completely. And enjoy the fact that there might be transitions, which will not be by definition a bad thing. But finding something you're passionate about, that you feel matters to you and maybe even to society, is perfect. That's also what I wish my kids could do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. When you're studying all this and, of course, collecting all these different perspectives from like the whole demographic of a society, basically,
yeah,
how much do you also take out of that for your own decisions? Because how I understand it, this is a topic where you can learn super much. Doesn't matter how experienced you are for yourself.
Yeah, but Marcel,
true?
It's too late for me now. No, that's true. So, I mean, having these kind of topics on your plate on a daily basis makes you reflect every now and then. So in June, I will move home, like I mentioned before. And my wife and I will move closer to here. We will move into a small village called Rijmerstok. And that will also be a change of pace in life. And that's also because I have really thought about what is it that we need. So it's, if you have kids that are now both in college, that means also in 5 years, I hope they will not be in college anymore. And it's now being recorded. So yeah, maybe they listen to it. But I mean, that's a transition also, right? So it's not that what I'm spending and now will be for eternity. So I really thought about what will be the next episode for us. And that's also how I want to construct my life. So that's also why I chose Maastricht, and I enjoy the pace of life. But you also have to transition into that new pace. I'm not going to slow down, but I want to open my horizon a bit. If I would just carry on, let's say like I did in Tilburg, which was really nice, well, then I'm just repeating myself. And I think that is not something very healthy for a long period in life. So rethinking the balance you have, and that includes balance in life, private work, but also balance like household finance, balance sheets. I think that helps because, yeah, that's what life throws at you, right? If you just make a plan once and you stick with it for 30 years, I think it becomes sad and boring. So every 5 years, recalibrating your plan. That's also what we are doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to sum all this topic up on household finance, again, more from a perspective of someone who's just getting in first touch with this topic. If I'm someone who had not that much of an idea about household finance before maybe listening to this podcast or reading something about it, where should I start if I have the ambition to improve my awareness for this whole topic?
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, there is a paper that I liked. Actually, I was in the room when the presentation was given by a guy called John Campbell. And he was not the inventor of the term household finance, but he gave the presidential address of the American Finance Association in early 2000s. And it's written down also, it's called Household Finance. It's an article in the Journal of Finance. To be fair, I think if you read the first 3 pages, I think that is inspiring. If you read the full 35 pages, you think, oh, boring. So maybe start with the first 3, because there he explains why is this topic now relevant, what are we facing as society, so what needs to be done. It's more like an agenda, and I really responded to that. But it is not a topic that has been fully serviced yet, so that's also why I want to have the chair. So there's FIRE, the Financial Independent Retire Early movement, but that's not household finance. It's a very dramatic version of it, that you should save everything you have, don't ever buy coffee at Starbucks, live in a small, tiny house, and then when you're 36, you can retire. Yes, that's one version of it, but I'm not sure whether it's nice to retire when you're 36, right? Then you live in a tiny house and you think, what's next?
What to do with all the time?
But people can make their own decisions. But that is a version of household finance, but I'm sure there will be many versions and everybody will find hers or his. But there's not a podcast that I can recommend, because most podcasts about money are really about getting rich. Mm-hmm. I'm really more into becoming happy. And for being happy, you should not be naive, because things will have a price tag. So I'm not about that. But I haven't found a podcast yet on that topic. So also on books, 9 of 10 books on household finance would be on getting wealthy. Mm-hmm. Which I think is nice if that is your dream. But for most people, it doesn't need to be the dream. So I'm not promoting my own book here, but I do think it's important that you just grasp what you think and collect. So maybe household finance, John Campbell, would be a good start.
Mm-hmm. Maybe also, before summing it up and also having perspective on your active work here, and because you just started, one final question about real estate and this topic, because I announced it earlier on. Still, we discussed if it's like a good decision or not to buy a house right now or a flat, maybe on another page. But still, young people, a lot of them are dreaming or thinking about this. If you want to achieve this goal and make a smart decision on that, first, what, from your opinion, should young people take into account, and also more precisely, what could be potential advantages and disadvantages in having that goal?
Well, that's a good topic. I think that we will discuss a full lecture on that in the course. That's what I thought of when I walked over here. So this paper will give you those perspectives. So on a way, it's counterintuitive, because I dislike the fact that society has made the real estate market so cramped, so that buying a house makes perfect sense if you can, because it will in most cases be cheaper. So you can also rent it and then find a roommate, and then he or she will pay rent. If it's all affordable, it's fine, but very often you also see almost explosion of exploitation with people, and that I dislike a lot. So I would rather see a society and a housing market where people can just choose. I would like to spend 500-600 euros on a room, or in this case we're 3 others, and then we can rent either an apartment for that budget or buy it. And the consequence should not be dramatically different, and at the moment it is, but only very few people can buy a house when they're studying or just after that. And that's really, I think, something that needs to happen. So we need to get a more balanced housing market. At the moment, if I would advise people, financially, of course, buying is very often cheaper, but it's not very natural to buy an apartment at a very young age. I have also considered this for my daughter, but I don't think it's smart to start your first address as owning an apartment. Although financially that sounds really sound, but it's also a transition in society. I hope that in 10-15 years society goes back to a housing market where everybody of every generation has something to choose between, and then it's really about what do you need at this moment. Do you need of course you need affordable housing, I hope, decent housing, but whether you should own it or rent it, should not make that big of a difference as it does now. So that's a very long, vague answer to that question.
But what do you think needs to be done to be in that situation in 10, 15 years, to have these opportunities that both make sense?
Yeah.
What needs to change, for example, in a city like Maastricht, but also like in different parts of the country?
I really believe there needs to be a much more integral approach. So very often people say we have to build like hell almost, like 100,000 buildings, houses need to be built every year, but we don't manage to do that. That will also contribute to relax the housing market a bit. But at the same time, and that's what I mean with integral, we also have to reconsider who lives where. Because, to be honest, a lot of people live in an address and they have, for instance, enjoyed very low rent, although their income is really high. And I'm not saying that is a sin, but it also doesn't make sense. It's almost like a game, the housing market, and if you have been in it, you have been benefiting from it. And I think it needs to be more solidary and also more fair to everyone. So the fact that you are young, so my daughter now is 19, that means she has 1 year on the waiting list of a social housing association. You can't subscribe when you're 17. So if that is the only key that determines when you will be where you are in the queue, that's not fair, because people who are old are then, well, they have an advantage. So I think for young generations, the system needs to recalibrate a bit. So it's not a fixed and simple solution. I really think it needs to be integrated. So indeed, construction needs to be on a larger scale, but we also have to reconsider how supply is being spread, and also how we will, let's say, make housing available to people. Because I do think that we have very old systems and decisions, sometimes from the 1950s, that are still ruling the housing market, and that really needs to be reconsidered.
Okay. Maybe also going back to you and your chair that you now own.
Me and my
here
chair.
at Maastricht University, your professor's chair.
Yeah.
To going back maybe to a bit more personal perspective after covering all these complex topics about housing, real estate, household finance. What are maybe your personal goals or things that you would like to achieve with your academic chair that you just started some months ago?
Yeah, now you also caught me in the act, right? Because you would assume I have a major plan. So with this super PAC, my ecosystem of organizations, I have a research agenda for sure. So I know topics that I would like to explore, fact-based, data-driven, with PhD students. So we are setting up now, let's say, new projects and positions. And these will also yield answers to, I think, very relevant, important questions. And I don't think it's nice to tell all of that now at the end of the podcast, because that might become very detailed and boring. But I think maybe overall, more importantly, is I really would like to, over the next 5, make sure that household finance becomes a topic that people enjoy listening to and thinking about every now and then. So maybe this podcast can be the start of that, because I really would like to popularize household finance a bit. And maybe not by calling it household finance, because that might be intimidating to some people, but thinking about what you need and what you have and how you can connect the two can be done in many ways. And so I don't need to become famous for that, but I would like the topic to become famous, because as soon as people start thinking about it more structured, I think better things will happen. And especially in the Netherlands, we know people will have to start thinking about it, because decisions will need to be made by households. And I just want to prevent that people make mistakes. And people will always make mistakes. I'm not naive, but I would like to reduce the level of mistakes a bit. And then if I can, make people excited about thinking once a year about household finance in 5 years, the next 5 years, if I achieve that, I'm a happy man living in a village somewhere nice and quiet, having the right balance. Yeah.
This actually sounds like super cool goals to work towards through.
I'm also looking for research assistants, students assistants. So for the podcast, indeed, I'm building the ecosystem. So if students say, wow, that sounds like a cool topic, I hope they think that. I'm still looking for a student assistant. I haven't put out the ad yet, but I'm easy to find, I guess, online. And people can send me an email or whatever it is on social media. And then get in touch, because I would like to work with young people on this, because it's really more about the young people I worry more than the baby boomers. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think after discussing these topics here, it helps to understand it. And from my personal perspective, I think that we talked about a super exciting topic with so many different perspectives. So Dirk, thank you so much for the conversation and all the answers that you gave us.
Thank you for being the guest in your first podcast, Marcel. So I think it went well. But let the listeners judge about that.
Exactly. I really enjoyed it. And to all the people listening or watching it, thank you for staying the whole time with us, and hopefully see or hear you next time here at the SBE Podcast.
For sure.